The first thing I felt when I opened my eyes was the cold.
The divorce papers were beside my bed. He signed them while machines were breathing for me. He had already decided I was gone. But I stood up, and surviving was only the beginning.
My Korean Mafia boss husband divorced me while I was dying when I survived. He lost me forever. The first thing I felt when I opened my eyes was the cold. Not the cold of the room, though the hospital air was sharp enough to cut glass. It was the cold inside my chest. The kind that settles in when your body has been fighting so hard to stay alive that it forgot to feel anything else. I lay there for 37 seconds before I moved. I counted them. One for every year I had spent believing that the man who put a ring on my finger in a soul ceremony, surrounded by men in black suits, and one Korean Mafia boss trying very hard not to let his hands shake at the altar, was mine. He wasn't. The divorce papers were on the table beside my bed. I recognized his signature before I read a single word. Min Jun's handwriting was like everything else about him, precise, controlled, final. He had signed on a Tuesday. I know because the notary stamp said so. I was unconscious on Tuesday. I was unconscious on Monday and Wednesday, too. I had been unconscious for 11 days while machines breathed for me and nurses whispered in the hallway that I probably wouldn't make it to the weekend. I made it to the following Thursday. I sat up in that hospital bed, pulled the IV line carefully from the back of my hand the way the nurses had shown me once during a routine check, and I held those papers in both hands. I read every word, every clause, every carefully drafted legal sentence that amounted to one simple thing. He had decided I was already gone and had made it official before my body had a chance to disagree. Then I folded the papers in half, tucked them under my arm, and I stood up. My legs shook. 11 days in a bed will do that to you. But I stood. I made it to the doorway before a nurse found me. She was very calm about it, the particular calm of someone trained to handle patients who wake up and immediately try to leave. She brought me back to the bed without dramatics. She said my discharge would be evaluated in 2 days, that my body had been through a significant trauma and standing up on day 13 was not the same as being ready to walk out. She was right. I spent 2 more days in that hospital. I let them do what they needed to do. But something had already been decided in that doorway, in those 30 seconds on my own 2 feet with the papers under my arm. Something shifted into place that no amount of additional recovery would shift back. When I walked out of that hospital 2 days later, properly discharged, properly upright, signed out in every official sense, I was not the woman Kang Min-jun had married. That woman was still somewhere in those white sheets, in the ghost of who she had been before 11 days of machines. The woman who left was something the accident had built without meaning to harder in the places that had been soft, quieter where there used to be noise, and completely clear about what came next. If you have ever loved someone so completely that you built your entire world around them, only to find out they used the moment you were closest to death to erase you from their life, then you already know where I was standing. This is the story of how I survived, and how surviving was only the beginning. I need you to understand something before I tell you the rest. Kang Min-jun was not a man you stumbled into by accident. He was the kind of man who appeared in news articles written with very careful language businessman, entrepreneur, prominent soul-based investor. The kind of articles where everyone who knows the real story reads between every single line and says nothing out loud. His family had run the Kang organization for 3 generations. Clean on paper, immovable underneath. His men wore suits that cost more than most people's cars and moved through rooms the way that predators move through tall grass, quiet, deliberate, aware of everything at once. I was Zara Hayes, American, 28 years old. Corporate attorney working for an international trade firm that had recently signed a landmark partnership with Kang Holdings' legitimate business arm. I was the youngest attorney at the table by 12 years. I had prepared for that meeting for 6 weeks. I had every clause memorized before I walked in. The first time I met Min-jun, he was sitting across that boardroom table from 4 senior partners. All of them men, all of them older, all of them trying very hard to hide how nervous they were. He wasn't looking at any of them. He was turning through the contract page by page with the patient, unhurried focus of someone who believed he had all the time in the world because he did. Then he looked up. He looked at me, not at my boss, not at the senior partner beside me, at me. "The clause on page 47, he said. "Who drafted it?" "I did," I said. He nodded once. "Fix the language in section C, then we'll sign." That was it. That was how it started. I fixed section C. He signed. 6 months later, he asked me to dinner. 4 months after that, he asked me to marry him in the kitchen of his Seoul penthouse at 2 in the morning while we were both still in work clothes, and he had a pen tucked behind his ear from reviewing files all evening. He didn't have a ring. He told me he hadn't planned it. He said he had been standing in that kitchen watching me eat leftover bibimbap from a container, and the words had just come out of him. I said yes before he finished the sentence. "I know what you're thinking." A black American woman building a life inside one of Seoul's most feared criminal families, the kind of crossing that other people draw maps around, marking what belongs with what was never going to be simple. Nobody in either world was going to make it simple for us. But that is the thing about real love when it is actually real. It does not wait for the world to decide it is allowed. What I had not told Minjun, what I had never found a reason to mention, was that I had known about the Kang organization long before I met him. My father's firm had handled portions of the Hayes-Kang partnership documentation 2 years before that boardroom meeting. I had personally reviewed 3 clauses in the original infrastructure agreement. I had flagged problems in 2 of them. I had written the replacement language. I knew that contract better than anyone in the Kang organization did, because I had helped build it before Minjun knew my name. That detail would matter later. More than I could have predicted. We were married for 2 years and 3 months. For 2 years and 3 months, I was Mrs. Kang. I sat beside him at dinners where men with dangerous eyes assessed me across crystal glasses and said nothing to my face and everything behind my back. I learned the art of being loved by a man who expressed it only in private and protected it fiercely, even when that protection looked like silence. I learned the layout of his world, and I fit myself into it carefully, the way you fit yourself into a space you respect but have never fully been invited to own. I thought that was what love looked like in a world like his. A man who showed you everything in private and protected you through silence in public. A man whose affection was demonstrated not in words but in the particular way he always positioned himself between you and the nearest exit when you were in a room full of people who had not yet decided if they trusted you. The way he remembered, without being told, that you took your coffee without sugar. The way he would stop talking mid-sentence sometimes when you walked into a room, and whatever he was saying simply became less important. I thought those things were enough. I had convinced myself that a love that existed primarily in private was still a complete love. That being chosen quietly was the same as being chosen fully. I was wrong about that too. Let me tell you about the first time I understood that Minjun's world would never fully accept me, no matter how long I stayed in it. 3rd month of marriage. He held what he called a gathering at his estate, not a party, because Minjun never called anything a party. A gathering. 50 people who mattered in his world, in the formal dining room, at a table long enough that I needed to nearly raise my voice to be heard from one end to the other. His chief of staff, Seon Park, had arranged the seating. I was at the far end of the table. He was at the head. Between us were 48 people and one very deliberate distance. I was seated between 2 men who spoke almost no English and across from a woman who spent the entire 3-hour dinner talking past me as though I was part of the floral arrangement rather than the host's wife. When I reached for the wine, I caught Seon looking at me from across the room with an expression I would later spend months trying to correctly name. It wasn't hostility. It was something colder than that. Assessment. The way you look at a problem you have already decided how to solve. She held my gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then she smiled, the kind of smile that means the precise opposite of what a smile is supposed to mean, and turned away to refill someone else's glass. Minjun, from the far end of that table, noticed none of it. He was deep in conversation with 3 men whose names I was never allowed to know. Afterward, when his driver took me upstairs and Minjun stayed below with his guests, I sat on the edge of our bed and told myself it was only the 3rd month. These things take time. Different cultures, different worlds, different rules. People warm up. They come around. They did not come around. 8 months into the marriage, I walked into Minjun's private office to deliver documents he had left at home, a routine thing, something I had done a dozen times. His schedule had shifted. He wasn't there. But Seon was. Sitting at his desk, sorting through files with the specific ease of someone who believed that chair belonged to her in a way that mine never would. She looked up when I walked in. She didn't stand. She didn't move. "He's not here," she said. "I know," I said. "I'm leaving these for him." I set the documents on the corner of the desk and turned to leave. I was almost at the door. "You know this won't last." I stopped walking. Her voice was very calm. The way a person sounds when they have rehearsed something until it feels natural. "He respects you, but respect isn't love. And love isn't enough when the family has certain expectations about who carries the Kang name forward." I turned around slowly. "He married me," I said. "He surprised everyone," she said, "including himself. But surprises have a shelf life. And I think, if you're honest with yourself, you already know that." I left without responding. That was my first serious mistake. I should have told Min Jun that same night, should have sat down with him and said, "Your chief of staff said this to me, and I need you to hear it." Instead, I told myself I didn't want to seem insecure. I told myself she was just positioning. I told myself a great many things over that year that I now understand were the stories I was using to avoid the truth I wasn't ready to face. Sona was not posturing. She was showing me the outline of a plan I wasn't yet aware of. 14 months in, Min Jun started staying out late in a way that felt different from every other late night his life had always required. Not different in obvious ways. He didn't stop coming home. He didn't stop being present at dinner when we had it together. But there was a quality of absence even when he was in the room, the phone face down on the table, the answers that were one word when they used to be three, the way he would look at his watch when he thought I wasn't watching and then look at nothing for a moment afterward. I noticed because I had spent 2 years paying very careful attention to a man who expressed most of what he felt in spaces between words rather than in the words themselves. I had learned to read him. And what I was reading no longer matched anything I recognized. I asked him once. I kept my voice very even, very calm. I said, "Is there something you need to tell me?" He looked at me that direct, unreadable look that used to make me feel seen and was beginning to make me feel invisible and said, "Business, Zara. Go to sleep." I nodded. I didn't push. I had been telling myself for months that pushing was the wrong move, that demanding explanations in a world where he operated on silence was the fastest way to lose the ground I'd spent 2 years building. Silence was never going to protect me. I was already losing ground. The distance between where I was standing and where the ground actually was, that was already enormous. I just could not see it yet. When I was first admitted to the hospital before the coma, before the 11 days of machines, there was a window of about 90 minutes when I was still conscious, but the doctors were being very honest about what conscious meant in my situation. Internal bleeding, 2 fractured ribs, head trauma significant enough that they were using the word critical without softening it. Mrs. Kang came, Min Jun's mother. A woman who had been cold to me for 2 years with the practiced, beautiful warmth of someone who had spent a lifetime making coldness look like restraint. She wore all black. She sat in the chair beside my bed like she was attending something she had been expecting. She looked at me the way you look at something that has disappointed you by failing to disappear on its own schedule. "Min Jun is on his way," she said. I know. My voice barely had volume. "When he arrives," she said, folding her hands in her lap, "don't make this harder for him than it needs to be. He has a great deal to manage right now." At the time, I thought she meant the fear of seeing me like this, asking me to be calm for his sake, to be easy, to not make a scene. I thought she was speaking the way people speak when they are frightened, and it comes out as instruction. She was not frightened. She was informing me. She was telling me to cooperate with what was already in motion. She left before Min Jun arrived. She had said what she came to say. The next time I saw her, I was standing on my own 2 feet outside the gate of my father's house, and she had considerably less to say. And then there were the papers. 11 days. That is how long I was unconscious. 11 days of machines and tubes and nurses moving quietly in and out of a room while my body decided, independently, what it was going to do. When I opened my eyes, Min Jun was not there. His lawyer was not there. His mother was not there. No one from the Kang family, not a single one of the dozens of people who had comprised my life for 2 years was in that room. The papers were just there. On the side table beside my bed, placed neatly beside a glass of water and a box of tissues with the matter-of-fact arrangement of practical items for a practical transaction. His signature on page 6. The notary stamp dated 11 days earlier. Filed with the court while I was on a ventilator. signed and submitted before my body had resolved its own question about whether it was going to stay. He had not waited to find out if I would live. He had made his calculation based on a prognosis someone had given him, and that calculation was that I would not. And he had used the space between my living and my dying to complete a transaction he wanted done. The nurse who came in to check my vitals stopped moving when she saw me sitting up with the papers in both hands. She looked at me with the specific frightened expression of someone who has walked in on a scene they were supposed to avoid. "Ma'am," she said carefully, "Mr. Kang's office called yesterday. They said when you were stable enough, you'd be transferred to a private facility." "Thank you," I said. My voice was steady. I was surprised by how steady it was. "I won't be transferring." She opened her mouth, closed it. "Can you bring me my phone?" I said. "And a glass of water, please." She brought both without another word about transferring. Here is the precise thing Kang Min-jun expected when he signed those divorce papers. He expected me to die. Not cruelly, or maybe cruelly. I have stopped trying to interpret it charitably. He expected the machine to settle the question so that he would not have to. He expected the papers to be a formality that would be rendered unnecessary within days, a document that would live in a file and never need to be explained because there would be no one left to ask for an explanation. Director Song the man I will tell you about shortly confirmed this for me months later. He told me Min-jun had been informed by his own medical consultant that my injuries were unsurvivable, that the internal damage was catastrophic, that I had a 48-hour window at best. That consultant had been provided with information that was not accurate and paid to deliver a prognosis that served a purpose. I was not supposed to make it past day 2. I made it to day 11. What nobody in Min-jun's world knew, what even I did not fully understand then, was that I had been in a serious accident before. At 19. Severe enough that the surgeons who put me back together that time had done something to my internal architecture that made me, in the words of my current surgeon, remarkably resilient to the specific category of trauma I had just sustained. My body had learned, years ago, how to survive things it had no business surviving. I survived 11 days on machines. I survived the infection that arrived on day 7. I survived a second surgery on day 9. And on the morning of day 13, I walked to the window of my hospital room on legs that shook and would not stop shaking, and I looked out at the city, and I understood something with a clarity I had never had before. He made a calculation. He was wrong. And what came next was going to be the direct consequence of exactly how wrong he was. Not one person in his world had expected this moment. Not his mother, who had sat in that chair and told me not to make it hard for him. Not Sion-ah, who had a great deal riding on me, not making it out of that room. Not the lawyer who filed the paperwork. Not the medical consultant who had delivered the false prognosis. None of them had prepared for a version of events where I walked out. I want to be specific about what those 11 days produced in me, because I think people assume that surviving something dramatic changes you in dramatic ways. That you emerge with some kind of clarity that arrives fully formed, like a revelation with clean edges. That is not what happened. What happened was quieter and more permanent than that. Each day in that room, while the machines did what my lungs could not, something was being decided somewhere inside me that had nothing to do with the accident or Min-jun or the papers sitting on the side table. Something was simply settling, the way sediment settles to the bottom of still water when you finally stop disturbing it. The way you discover what is actually there when the motion stops. What I found, when the motion stopped, was a woman who had spent 2 years making herself quieter and smaller and more accommodating than she ever needed to be. Because somewhere along the way, she had decided that belonging to someone's world was worth the cost of shrinking to fit inside it. That being chosen in private was the same as being fully protected. That silence from the man who loved her was the same as safety. She was wrong about all of it. And she did not walk out of that hospital. Something sturdier did. That was their mistake. And it was a permanent one. If you are watching this from Atlanta, from Lagos, from London, from Seoul, and you have ever had someone count you out before you were finished, drop your city in the comments right now. Because what happens next is for every single person who was supposed to stay down and decided not to. Let me tell you what I did not know while I was lying in that hospital room counting days. I did not know about the driver. The man who had run my car off the road on that Tuesday evening, the truck that had crossed the center line on the bridge outside the city in what the police report called a probable distraction incident, his name was Kevin Marsh. He had left the country within 48 hours of the accident. Immigration records showed a flight to Busan. After Busan, nothing. He had evaporated. Everyone called it an accident. What was contained in the folder director song would later hand me in that hospital corridor was a different account entirely. Kevin Marsh had been on Sionar Park's personal payroll for 4 months before that Tuesday evening, not as a driver, as a contractor. The payment records did not specify services rendered. They did not need to. And I did not know about the report. 3 days before the accident, Sionar had delivered to Kang Min-jun a 40-page document, printed, bound, with sourced appendices and time-stamped communications that looked like evidence and were entirely fabricated. The document alleged that I had been building a case against the Kang organization for 8 months, that I had been meeting regularly with an international financial crimes investigative unit, that my position as his wife had been a strategic placement from the beginning, that I had married him, not because I loved him, but because I was inside the wall. Every word of it was constructed. Every piece of supporting documentation had been manufactured by someone who understood exactly how to make something look real to a man who trusted her completely. Sonar had worked for Min-jun for 7 years. 7 years of accurate information, correct assessments, judgments he had never had reason to question. She knew exactly how much trust she had accumulated. She spent it all on 40 pages about me. He believed her. He did not come to me. He did not ask me a single question. He looked at 40 pages of a fabricated story about who I was and made a permanent decision without ever once checking whether the story was true. That was the thing I could not move past. Not that he believed her people believe the people they trust. Not even that he signed the papers. It was that he looked at 40 pages claiming his wife was a plant, a fraud, a strategic actor inside his own life, and he decided that she was not worth one direct question. That told me everything I needed to know about the foundation of what we had built. Love that cannot withstand a question was never the kind of love I actually had. I made one phone call from that hospital room. Not to Min-jun. Not to a friend, not to a therapist or a crisis line or anyone I had leaned on before. I called my father. Charles Hayes had been many things across his life, none of them simple, most of them powerful in ways that did not announce themselves loudly. He was the majority silent stakeholder in the international holding company that provided the clean legal infrastructure for Kang Holdings' entire legitimate global operation. A partnership he had arranged years before my marriage, because that is the kind of man my father is, the kind who builds things before anyone knows they will be needed. When my marriage to Min-jun had become clear, my father had quietly restructured one element of that partnership. He had added a clause, buried in Section 14 of the subsidiary contract, written in language dense enough that 3 lawyers and considerable patience would be required to fully decode it. The clause stated, in the event of hostile dissolution of any personal union between a Hayes family member and a Kang organization principal defined as dissolution initiated unilaterally, without mutual consent, under circumstances constituting harm to the Hayes party, all Hayes-adjacent asset contributions to the partnership would revert to Hayes family control within 90 days of the dissolution being formally contested. Min-jun had signed those divorce papers on a Tuesday. I had 90 days from that stamp. My father picked up the phone on the first ring. "Are you standing?" he said. He always led with that question when something had happened, his way of calibrating. "I'm sitting," I said, "but I'll be standing soon." "Good," he said. The word carried everything he wasn't going to say. "I'll have counsel to you within the hour." Here is the second thing nobody had accounted for. For the last 18 months of my marriage, not from the beginning, not even from suspicion, but from the slow, careful accumulation of knowing that the ground beneath something is not as solid as it appears, I had been doing what any attorney does when she feels a structure shifting. I had been building a record of my own, not evidence against Min-jun's operations, nothing like what Sionar had fabricated. A record of my own contributions, my legal work. The partnership contracts I had restructured that had saved Kang Holdings an estimated $40 million in potential regulatory exposure over 2 years. The terms I had personally negotiated on 3 separate international agreements. The 6 subsidiary operating contracts I had co-signed as a named party. That last detail had seemed like a formality at the time. A courtesy. Min-jun's legal team had presented it as standard practice for a spouse involved in the business side. I had signed without thinking much about it. I had signed my name beside his on 6 of the most critical operating instruments in his legitimate business structure. A divorce filed without my consent, without negotiation, without my signature on the dissolution in the jurisdiction we were operating in, did not automatically terminate co-signatory status on instruments that predated the petition. I was still a named party on 6 agreements. Min Jun had divorced me. He had not divorced my signature from his business. The third piece arrived in a corridor. A man was waiting outside my hospital room when I was discharged. Tall, mid-50s, grey at the temples, with the posture of someone who had spent 30 years being the most dangerous person in any room while ensuring no one clocked it. Director Song. Min Jun's head of legal operations for 11 years. The man who had quietly held the legitimate side of the Kang organization together through 3 separate regulatory reviews and 2 international partnership restructurings. He had an envelope in his hand. "Miss Hayes," he said. "Not Mrs. Kang." "Director Song," I said. "I need you to see something before you leave," he said. The envelope contained 43 pages. Kevin Marsh's payment records from Sionar's accounts. Her internal communications, secured through means Director Song did not specify, and I did not ask about. The bribed medical consultant's correspondence. A detailed documented timeline from the month before my accident through the day of my discharge, written in Director Song's precise handwriting that began with a single line. What was reported to Mr. Kang and what actually occurred are not the same event. I read all 43 pages standing in that hospital corridor in street clothes with an IV bruise still yellowing on the back of my hand. When I finished, I looked up at Director Song. "Why are you giving me this?" I said. He considered the question. "Because in 11 years of working for this organization," he said, "every decision Mr. Kang made was based on accurate information. Until this one." He paused. He was deceived, but he still signed. He handed me the envelope. He turned and walked away down that corridor without looking back. I stood there for a long moment in the silence he left behind. Then I squared my shoulders, picked up my bag, and walked toward the exit. I left that hospital on a Thursday morning at 9:45. My father's assistant had brought what I asked for. Cream coat, white underneath, clean and uncomplicated. No luggage there was nothing in that room I needed to take. I carried the divorce papers in a folder under my arm. I carried Director Song's envelope in my bag. I carried 11 days of machines, and everything those 11 days had built in me out through those hospital doors and into the morning air. 3 of Min Jun's men were positioned near the entrance. Not to block me, I don't think they had instructions clear enough to block me, because no one had prepared instructions for this specific scenario. They stood by the entrance looking at me with the particular expression of men trained for clear situations who have encountered something that is not one. I walked past them without slowing. One of them started to say something. He stopped himself, uncertain which name applied. I didn't help him decide. I got into my father's car without looking back at that building once. On Friday morning, my father's legal team filed the Hayes Clause activation with the partnership's governing board. 40% of the legitimate operating infrastructure of Kang Holdings, the clean side, the side that allowed Min Jun to move through the world as a businessman rather than whatever the accurate word was, began its transition back toward Hayes family control pending the 90-day review. The governing board notification reached Kang Holdings at 9 in the morning. My father told me over dinner that Min Jun called him at 9:17. He answered on the 3rd ring. "Charles," Min Jun said. "Min Jun," my father said. A silence long enough to have real weight. "There has been a misunderstanding," Min Jun said. "Has there?" my father said. Not a question. "I would like to arrange a meeting. My daughter," my father said, "is available to discuss nothing. Her attorneys are available to discuss the clause. You have my counsel's information." He ended the call. My father delivered this to me with the same unhurried calm he uses to tell me everything. But there was something in his eyes when he finished, not satisfaction exactly, but the particular piece of a man who has waited to say a precise thing and said it precisely at the correct moment. Min Jun held his annual organization summit 3 weeks after I left the hospital. Director Song informed me of the date. I arrived at the venue 20 minutes before it began and walked into the lobby and sat in a chair in the atrium visible from the main entrance to the summit hall, and I waited. Black dress. Watch my father gave me for law school graduation. Hair down. The folder on my lap. Min Jun walked in at 9:58. He saw me at 9:59. He stopped walking. His entire security detail stopped around him. 6 men in black suits and 1 Korean Mafia boss who had, for the first time in the 2 years and 3 months I had known him, no prepared expression for the situation in front of him. The other men in that lobby I recognized, senior figures in his organization who had spent 2 years looking through me, the way you look through a window rather than at one were watching us now. Not with warmth, with the specific recalibration that happens in rooms like that one when someone they had categorized as peripheral reveals herself as something foundational. I could feel the shift, the reassessment moving through the room like a current. I stood up. I walked toward him the way you walk when the outcome has already been determined, and the only remaining item is making sure the other person understands it before the day continues. I stopped 4 feet from him. "Min-jun!" I said. "Zara." His voice carried something I had never heard in it before, something that would have moved me, once. "I wanted you to see me," I said. "Before your summit, before your day begins. I wanted you to start this morning knowing I walked out of that hospital, and that everything coming next you did to yourself." I held out the folder. He didn't take it. I set it on the table beside us, the Hayes Clause filing, the subsidiary documentation, Director Song's 43 pages, and I stepped back. "Your attorneys have copies," I said. "Have a good summit." I walked to the lobby exit. Every man in that room watched me move through it. Min-jun did not follow. I know, because I counted my own footsteps, all the way to the door, and did not hear a single one behind them. If you have ever walked away from something that tried to bury you and walked away standing type A alive in the comments, just that word. Because that is exactly what this is. Director Song presented his full statement to the organization's internal review board on the day of the summit. Kevin Marsh's payment records. The fabricated intelligence report Sionar had delivered to Min-jun. The bribed consultant's documented correspondence. The timeline from the month before my accident through the day I walked out. All of it, 43 pages, organized in Director Song's precise and methodical way. The review board convened that same afternoon. Sionar was called in from another meeting. She walked into that room the way you walk in when you don't yet know what's waiting composed, prepared for something she could manage. Director Song told me she held her composure for the first 3 minutes. Very calm, precise in her responses. The specific steadiness of someone who has rehearsed a story until it has the texture of memory. Then they showed her the payment records. She was removed from the Kang organization the following morning. Not quietly in this world, there is no such thing as a quiet removal. Removed in the specific way that meant access codes that no longer functioned, calls that went unreturned, and people who had looked to her for 7 years finding somewhere else to direct their eyes when they passed her on the street. When Director Song told me, I sat with it for a while. I did not feel what I expected to feel. I did not feel triumph or satisfaction or anything with an edge to it. I felt something quieter and more complete, the sound of a door closing finally after being held open too long. He came to my father's house on a Sunday morning. No convoy, no security team. Just Min-jun and one driver, parked at the gate in the early morning like a man who had not been entirely sure he was going to come until he was already there. My father's staff told me at 8:15. I finished my coffee. I changed my shoes. I went downstairs and I met him at the front gate. Not inside. Not in a room with chairs where a conversation could take root. At the gate, in the cool morning light, with the sound of the city audible behind him. He looked tired. Not broken Min-jun would not break. I understood that about him now, with more clarity than I'd ever had when I loved him. But tired in the way powerful men look when the structure their power rests on has shifted and they have not yet found new footing. "Zara," he said. I waited. I was wrong. He said it the way people say things they have practiced, but that still costs something when they arrive. I should have asked you. Before any of it, I should have come to you directly and asked you. "I know you were wrong," I said. "The report she gave me was fabricated," I said. "Yes." Director Song showed me the same documentation he showed you. She had 7 years of accurate information, I said. "I know." And then she gave you 40 pages of lies about your wife, and you chose to believe them without asking her a single question. While she was in a coma, Min-jun. You signed papers while I was on a ventilator. He didn't flinch the way most people flinch. Just a stillness, a fractional pause that on Min-jun communicated everything. "What do you need?" he said quietly. "To fix this?" And there it was. The question. The moment most of these stories pivot on, she names a condition. He meets it. The architecture of what they had gets rebuilt with new materials. I had turned this moment over in my mind during 11 days of machines and weeks of recovery and mornings in my father's house sitting with the coffee and the silence. I looked at Kang Min-jun, the man I had loved enough to move to a city where I knew no one. The man who had asked me to marry him with a pen behind his ear at 2 in the morning and had meant every word of it in that kitchen. The man who had also looked at a fabricated story about who I was and decided it was more credible than 2 years of knowing me. Nothing, I said. He went very still. I watched something move across his face, not the controlled stillness I knew, but something beneath it, the thing underneath the architecture when the architecture fails to hold. He pressed 2 fingers to the side of his jaw, briefly, a gesture I had only seen him make once before the night he had received news about his father. His only tell. The only fracture point in the structure of him. I looked away. I had not come there to witness his pain. I had come to finish a conversation. "You don't need to fix anything for me," I said. "I am not asking you to repair this. I'm not asking you to earn anything back. What I needed from you was for you to trust me when it cost something to trust me. That was the only thing I ever needed, and that moment is gone now. So there is nothing left to fix." I stepped back from the gate. "Your legal team will hear from mine about the subsidiary agreements," I said. "The clause runs its 90 days. After that, we're done." I turned and walked back to the house. The gate closed behind me on its own. He did not call after me. He did not follow. He had come there to ask me what it would take, and I had given him the truest answer I had. Nothing he could give me. I stood just inside the gate for a moment, with the morning light coming through the trees and the sound of my father's house quiet behind me. I waited to feel something dramatic grief, maybe, or the particular collapse that comes after you have finally said the thing you spent months building up to say. Instead, I felt something much simpler, the absence of weight. Like a door I had been holding open against a wind had finally been allowed to close. I had not realized how much energy it takes to keep a door open that is trying to close on its own. I had not realized how tired I was from holding it. I let go. The door closed. I went inside and made myself another cup of coffee. That was the last time I spoke to Kang Min-jun. Let me tell you what the next 90 days looked like. For Min-jun, the Hayes Clause completed its process. 40% of the legitimate holding infrastructure transferred to Hayes family control. Not enough to end the Kang organization, Min-jun was too established, too embedded in the structures of his world for a single clause to collapse him, but enough that the revenue from the clean business arm dropped significantly. Stock analysts wrote about it in the careful language of people who don't fully understand what they are documenting. The newspapers that had called him an investor began using more precise language. He also lost director Song, who retired 6 weeks after the summit with the quiet finality of a man who had made a decision and would not be revisiting it. Song sent me a card. 4 sentences. The last one read, "Every structure requires the right foundation. You were always the right one." For Mrs. Kang, she sent a formal letter through attorneys expressing regret at the outcome of the situation. My father's attorneys responded with 4 words. "Thank you for writing. I thought about her sometimes in those 90 days. Not with anger. I had stopped carrying anger a few weeks after leaving the hospital because anger is heavy and I needed my hands free. But I thought about the way she had sat in that chair beside my bed and told me not to make things harder for him. I thought about what it must have cost her, in the end, to write a letter of regret to the woman she had assumed would not survive long enough to need one. Some costs arrive later than expected. That is usually when they cost the most. She had told me, in that hospital room, not to make it harder for him than it needed to be. I think about that sometimes. I think about how she came to that room expecting a certain kind of woman and found out, 90 days later, that she had been wrong about every calculation she had made. For Sionar, Kevin Marsh came back to Seoul. The circumstances of his return were not made public. He gave a full documented account. Sonar was charged. The proceedings were not short, and they were not quiet, and I did not attend them. I had other things to build. 3 months after I walked out of that hospital, my father and I signed the charter for Hayes Legal Partners, an international firm. Built on the infrastructure reclaimed through the clause process, expanded with 2 additional partners I had recruited during my recovery, housed in a building in the city centre with floor-to-ceiling windows, and a view of the river that went all the way to the horizon on clear days. My name on the door. My name only. Not Mrs. Kang. Not the woman who was married to. Just Zara Hayes, founding partner, on a bronze plate beside a door that I had unlocked with my own key. The first morning I stood in that office, I stood at the window for a long time, not thinking about Min-jun, not running through the accident or the 11 days or the papers or the corridor or the gate, just standing in the particular quiet of a woman who has walked through the thing that was supposed to end her and come out on the other side of it, holding something she built with her own hands. This is the thing they don't tell you about dark romance stories and slow burn love and the mafia boss love story that everyone watches from the outside, the interracial slow burn romance, the forbidden crossing, the woman who was never supposed to belong in that world. They tell you the love is the destination. That finding it, holding it, being chosen by it, that is what you were building toward. What I know now is that the real destination was always me. The woman I was capable of being if I stopped making myself smaller to fit inside someone else's idea of what I was worth. The attorney who restructured $40 million contracts and then spent 2 years believing that her value in her husband's world depended on his world accepting her. The woman who was supposed to die in that hospital room and instead stood up. I had loved Kang Min-joon. I want to be honest about that, because erasing that part would be its own kind of lie. The love was real. The grief of losing it was real. You can hold both of those things at once. You can have genuinely loved someone, genuinely grieved the loss of them, and still understand with complete clarity that you cannot return to a place where someone chose to erase you without asking you first. That is not bitterness. That is just knowing yourself well enough to protect what you survived to become. He lost me forever, not because I wanted him to suffer, but because I finally understood, standing in a hospital room with shaking legs and divorce papers in my hands, that I had never needed his world to accept me. I had only ever needed to accept myself. If there is one thing I want you to carry from this story, let it be this. The people who count you out in your lowest moment are not seeing you clearly. They are seeing their own fear, their fear of what you would become if you survived, if you stood up, if you walked out of that room and refused to stay quiet about what had been done to you. Zara Hayes was not supposed to walk out of that hospital. She did. And everything that came after every document filed, every clause activated, every door that opened, every morning in an office with her name on the bronze plate beside the door was not revenge. It was just the natural consequence of a woman who refused to stay in the story someone else wrote for her. You are not the story they wrote when they counted you out. You are not the version of yourself that exists in their calculations and their assumptions and their 40 pages of fabricated evidence about who you were supposed to be. You are the story you write when you stand up anyway. When your legs are shaking and the papers are in your hands and the room is cold and you stand up regardless. That story belongs to you. It always did.